Hi everyone. Welcome. I'm Alice Politi. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge. Thank you very much for joining us today for this timely discussion on China and European economic security, hosted by the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. We have the pleasure to have here with us today Dr. Francesca Ghiretti, research leader around Europe and also author of the book Chinese Investments and the Economic Security Turn in Europe, which, based on extensive fieldwork, provides really an invaluable in-depth analysis of the processes and drivers that have transformed European state economic interactions with China and have introduced a more prominent security dimension in the relationship between China and the European Union. So before starting with the discussion, please note that you can leave your questions in the Q&A section at any time, and then I will pick them up when we open the floor for Q&A. Francesca's book helps us understand a process that is still unfolding before our eyes. Over the past decade, and particularly since 2019, relations between the EU and China, as well as between the UK and China, have been hindered by growing tensions, started to increasingly encompass a security dimension. And this meant that, of course, balancing security concerns and de-risking strategy with constructive engagement with China has become increasingly difficult. So growing uncertainty, also brought about by the approach adopted by the current Trump administration, has added a further layer of complexity in the way the EU and its single member states and as well as the UK are handling the relationship with China. So to start, I wanted to ask Francesca, what was the motivation behind researching this topic, and then how this motivation led to the completion of the book, Chinese Investments and the Economic Security Turn in Europe?
Thank you, Alice. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here and for hosting this conversation, and looking forward to talk about this with you. Alice is also an expert in EU-China relations, so hopefully it will be a great conversation. So I suppose I should say something that is deeper than the motivation was. Yeah, I was writing a PhD on this topic, and so a book came out of that. I should say a little bit more. What happened was I was actually doing my master degree. I came across the topic of Chinese investments in the EU, and as I was writing my master dissertation, I noticed that a lot of these investments were starting to be labeled as a security risk, a security issue. And so I went into my PhD wondering, okay, this is an economic means, right? Investments is a purely economic means. How is it that something that drives the economic relationship and that used to be very much welcomed in the European Union becomes a security issue, a security threat? And so I started my PhD investigating these things and trying to get a better understanding of what different actors mean when they say that Chinese investments are a security risk, and how the debate around what we can call the securitization of Chinese investments has developed in a number of countries. Now, I just want to say something clearly right now, because I receive this question all the time. No, I did not assess whether the security risk was real or not. I only traced the debate and the view of the actors that adopted the policies to manage the risks related to Chinese investments, right? So the book and my PhD did not assess whether these views were real or, or just perceptions, but it tried to describe and analyze the reasons that triggered this type of views and how they were constructed to test whether the label, what was the content of the label at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, the main point of the book, really, but I mean, I know your research very well, and I guess what emerges from your work is that we could see a growing security dimension in the relationship, right? And I wanted to ask you, according to you, when did this economic security turn happen and why? So do you see this as a process starting before the leadership of Xi Jinping and then reaching its full maturity under Xi Jinping? Or do you see it as something that has stemmed from the more assertive approach that Xi Jinping has used? What do you think? What do you think are the triggers that prompt this shift, and when do you locate the shift?
The book locates the shift in the mid-2010s, so after the arrival of Xi Jinping. Now, since I finished the book, since I finished my PhD, the debate around economic security especially has taken a bit of a turn in which competitiveness and competition occupies quite a large role. And so if you think about that part of the debate that is much older, you can go, and part of the book talks about that, you can go back to the debate in the early 2000s related to anti-dumping, the so-called bra war of cheap textiles from China coming into the European Union, the whole debate around the market economy status, the guaranteeing of market economic status to China, where especially Italy was actively involved in that as well. So some of the grievances that you see in the expression of the securitization emerge earlier than Xi Jinping, but they didn't take that security connotation. It was still very much embedded into the leveling playing field conversation, reciprocity, fair competition, which at the time was not embedded into what today we would describe as economic security. It was something that had to do with to a certain extent regular WTO disputes kind of things, right? Now you move forward to the mid-2010s, and what happens is something slightly different. Following the 2010 euro crisis, you do see a lot of Chinese investments reaching the European Union, and while at the beginning these investments were highly welcomed, as I mentioned before, something happens at a certain point. And I think two main things happened, and this is what interviewees sort of confirmed. The first one is that there is a realization that China is coming to Europe rather than Europeans going to China. So the trend before was Europeans would investing in China, taking advantage of the Chinese market and the opportunities of the Chinese market and etc. They realize then that there is this trend where China is coming to Europe, and there's a wide presence, and what does that wide presence mean starts to change in the heads of the people. The second point is actually, and this is sort of the trigger case, there's a whole point in the book about how important are trigger cases when you look at securitization, and you have the acquisition of KUKA in Germany, the robot maker, right? And this triggers a couple of things. The first one is that Germany, the leader of the bilateral relationship economic bilateral relationship for sure, between the EU and China, starts to see these acquisitions as potentially threatening. Now, we can have a whole debate about, again, what do we mean when we say that these were threatening in the eyes of Germany? What did they mean by threat? But they do see a bit of a threat. And part of it has to do with dual use applications. Part of that has to do with loss of competitiveness, right? So that happens. A big, actor in the bilateral relationship between China and Germany China and the EU changes its position. The second thing is that a debate was already kind of emerging within the European Commission about the bilateral relationship with China, and especially investments. And at the same time, France was advocating for the adoption of an FDI screening mechanism. They already had one within their national borders, and they were thinking about whether it was necessary to have one at European level. So although one part of the debate would say, well, that securitization process emerges before the mid-2010s and is not entirely false, the security hat in terms of describing the economic relationship as something that has an impact on the security of the European Union doesn't really emerge until the debate around FDI screening comes to play. And this is why in the book I make the argument that actually without that debate, it would have been a lot harder for the European Union to have a debate on economic security these days. Of course, there are other elements, so I'm not saying that it's the only one. We can talk about the role of the COVID-19 and, etc. But that is sort of the moment where a series of things kind of align.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned now COVID-19, and in the book as well, you recognize the pandemic as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine as two main factors that have contributed to aggravate tensions in the relationship. And this, I mean, it's also reflected in official statements such as von der Leyen's speech at MERIC's NEPC in March 2023. So I want to ask you, how have these two war-changing events affected the securitization process investing EU-China relations, if they have, like, how do you see these two main events playing a role in this economic security shift?
So first of all, I was at the speech that von der Leyen gave. I was working at MERIC's at the time, so we were there, and it was an incredible speech. But I think that we need to differentiate a little bit between things that have to do with investments, and so the debate that sort of predated the whole de-risking agenda, and then the debate that then developed into and followed the de-risking agenda. COVID-19, for example, was still highly relevant for investments as well. COVID-19 was the moment where it became okay to talk about economic sovereignty. Within the European Union, obviously other places were also already talking about economic sovereignty, and you have member states that were already talking about economic sovereignty, but it became okay for the EU as a whole to start to discuss economic sovereignty, so much so that you find economic sovereignty being mentioned several times in European documents of that period of time. Why is that? Well, it's relatively easy. The disruption of supply chains linked to COVID-19, its dependency in terms of medical supply from China, rang a bit of an alarm bell within Brussels of, oh, wow, what do we do if we cannot be resilient and self-sufficient with the bare minimum that we need to survive as a society? And that sort of enhanced the conversation around dependencies. So where do we depend? Where are over dependencies? And within that debate, obviously, especially acquisitions, but not only, we see these days that the debate is expanded to greenfield investments as well. But the debate around acquisitions became much stronger, and the question of, okay, where do we have Chinese investments in areas of critical importance for our national security, for our society, and what do we do with that? So up to COVID-19, mainly also because the legislation passed in 2019, right? So it was very close as well. The debate around investments was still very strong. And I'm not saying it isn't at the moment, it's still there, but it has moved a little bit more towards greenfield investment. The whole debate around de-risking is a little bit larger. And it starts to inject that concept of economic security that has to do with both aspects, that more traditional national security aspect that has to do with cybersecurity, that has to do with critical infrastructure and critical supplies, and the more competitiveness type of debate that has to do with, okay, are our companies being pushed out by unfair competition? Are we being subjected to different standards? So, for example, Chinese companies have subsidies, we don't. Can we compete with them? Is our growth and prosperity at risk? Sort of, bottom line. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the comments in case they can hear me, but they can. Okay. So that develops a little bit more. And that is the de-risking debate. I'm not saying that 2023 was not an important year in the bilateral relationship between the EU and China. It was extremely important. First time a president of the European Commission gives a speech on a foreign actor. In theory, it's not part of what European Commission presidents do. So that was extremely important, and it showed how important China was in the debate at the time. EU have in the same year the China speech, and you also have in the same year the adoption of the economic security strategy, which in theory is country agnostic, and we need to repeat this. FDI screening in the EU is country agnostic. The entire toolbox is country agnostic, but obviously it's clear that China plays a central role there. Now I totally forgot. Yeah, sorry, just last point before we go back to questions. And also, Alice, if you have comments, please jump in. Russia. And why was I saying that de-risking is a wider debate is because Russia invasion of Ukraine is not necessarily something that changes the evaluation towards the securitization of Chinese investments, is something that changes the evaluations in regard to the bilateral relationship with China. The fact that China did not condemn the invasion, and the fact that they have, I mean, the US found evidence that China is indirectly and directly supporting Russia, that of course changes entirely the way in which especially Central and Eastern European countries look at China, because that becomes for them a national security priority. You know, this country is backing a country, Russia, that could be a national security risk for them. So if you look at the state visits that happened between 2022 and 2023, the topic of please stop supporting Russia or help us, you know, trying to put an end to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is always there, because it becomes the overarching act of the bilateral relationship between the EU and China to a certain extent.
Okay, thank you very much. And if I remember correctly, during the the speech that von der Leyen gave in March 2023, when she introduced the concept of de-risking, she really gave a lot of prominence to the issue of Ukraine, and she really emphasized how China's position on on Russia's aggression in Ukraine would have been a determining factor for the future of the relationship. And then of course there was the speech when she introduced the de-risking approach. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that with the introduction of the de-risking approach, which as you just mentioned has introduced formally that kind of security dimension in a more prominent way, do you think that that has moved the so-called tripartite approach, so China seen as a competitor, economic competitor, an ally on tackling transnational issues such as climate change, and a systemic rival? Do you think that has moved the approach a little bit more closer to the systemic rivalry maybe? Or has it changed in any way the approach that the EU had until that moment in 2023?
It's a great question, because it is one that we were asking ourselves in 2023, trying to understand whether the shift that we perceived and the shift that was definitely captured by that speech was happening at EU level, or whether it stopped even, you know, within the European Commission, because at the end of the day, even Brussels is a complicated set of institutions, right? And our perception was that this shift was real, right? There were so many variables that included so many different strata of the society and so many different member states that the shift was definitely there. But then you have the council statement of the 30th of June 2023, so just 10 days after the economic security strategy was published, and just a few months after the de-risking speech, where obviously the three-pronged, tripartite approach is repeated as such. So there is no reflection of that shift that we have perceived happened. The council only said, well, yeah, we're still here, basically. Where we were in 2019 when we adopted this approach in the strategic outlook. So there was a bit of a, I don't know, surprise on our end. We expected to see that shift being reflected in the words of the council. That was not the case. Now, is this enough to say that the shift hasn't occurred? I don't think so. But I wouldn't go as far as saying that we got closer to the systemic rivalry. I would say that the economic competitor part has become much more prominent. So we struggle with the partner part a lot more than in the past. Even high-level dialogues bring home very little deliverables. And it's really difficult to partner up with China, even in topics where on paper we want to and they want to, such as climate change. When you actually look in details at what contains collaboration in climate change, then you see that we actually compete in a lot of these chapters, green technologies, for example. the economic competitor part has become extremely prominent, right? A lot more than the systemic rival part. The systemic rival is there, but it still has less prominence compared to the part where we need to compete with China. China seems to be competing with different rules, and we seem to struggle to buy into those sectors in which China is a predominant player. So this is what I would say as an analyst. Obviously, by just looking at documents, this is not reflected in that council conclusion. So in theory, it seems that member states do not share this conclusion.
Thank you very much. And I mean, appunto, you mentioned how this economic competition factor becomes more and more prominent, and this together with elements of economic security, of course, has had an impact on the European business community, I imagine. And in your book, you talk extensively about the approach and reaction of the European business community. And you mentioned especially how in previous decades there hasn't been such a strong interference, right, that could be observed in economic affairs. And so I wanted to ask you, what have you observed maybe during your field work and your interviews? What has emerged in terms of the approach that the business community in Europe has adopted vis-a-vis this economic security term? Has there been any friction between governmental approaches and the EU approach at the institutional level? And then the approach of the interest of the European business community?
This is a very difficult question. The reason is that, and I'm sure you shared this, when you study the European Union, you already have obstacle number one, which is you're studying a regional union, and a good 90% of what you're studying has a correspondent national regulation or needs to be implemented by member states. So you have level one, the EU, then you have to think about level two, the member states. And then if you inject businesses, of course, there's an added layer of, okay, do these people share what their member state, for example, is saying, or the EU, or they have a different approach? And you also have sectoral subdivision, right? It doesn't mean that, for example, how, I don't know, a tech company reacts to a legislation is the same way in which the automotive sector may react. So this is just to say the picture is extremely mixed, and I'll go by steps, and I'll try to be short. So the first step is that even if you look at member states, the securitization process happened very differently in different member states, right? So you have different starting points in different member states. You have members such as France and Italy that for them it was easier to embrace this securitization process. True, the state hasn't been as involved as in the past in the economy, but at the same time there was still a wider acceptance of the state doing something that has to do with the economy and economic actors, right? While you have states such as the Netherlands, the Nordics, and the UK, where there is a much more liberal type of economic culture. So the state cannot interfere into the economic affairs. And so securitization happened initially in a sense that is much closer to the traditional sense of national security. So I'm going to protect national security and from economic threats, but I'm going to protect national security, which also means that businesses reacted differently because they were subjected to slightly different types of regulations when it came to FDI screening for sure, but also other regulations. Now, how have businesses react? We must say that the initial objection is slowly developing into a sense of this is happening, so we need to buy into the policy making process. So what you see the big difference, you see businesses being increasingly involved or trying to get involved in the early stages of the debate around regulations or the debate around types of restrictions and etc., in order to be able to shape the outcome. And this is something that, for example, currently in some places they lament the fact that they cannot shape the process and that they cannot be part of it. So while you had a first part where businesses were skeptical, some businesses were skeptical of this type of measures, other they actually welcomed it because they felt it as being a protection for themselves, right? We're going to protect our business bases and our champions from foreign acquisitions or unfair competition, to the point where they want to be part of the process and they want to shape the regulation together with policymakers. This is a generalization, but I've seen really the shift of businesses now embedding the idea, their own idea, but the idea of de-risking. And that not only has to do to the adoption of policies, but also has to do with growing geopolitical tension globally and the fact that they increasingly internalize the possibility of disruptions, not only making them lose revenues, but actually threatening their survival as a business, which used to be only the case for small and medium enterprises, and now is being increasingly embedded into multinationals as well.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question from what you just said. You mentioned these two levels, right? Of course, at the EU institutional level, and then the member states on bilateral relations with China. And did you, like in your study, did you observe whether like the recently introduced securitizing moves from EU institutions, whether these were implemented and instrumentalized quite coherently amongst member states, or whether there was a high level of incoherency, and if that's the case, did you notice a pattern, like which states were more compliant and which states were less compliant?
Yes, so to this day, the investment screening landscape in Europe is quite mixed. And there are a couple of obstacles to making it more coherent. That said, there is an ongoing process of review of the EU FDI screening instrument, where one of the objectives is to create minimum common denominators among the 27. So the first step was to ensure that everyone adopted an FDI screening mechanism and that there was a good mechanism to share information among member states, to ensure that if you had a transaction that could be threatening not just for your national borders but for the whole of the EU, the other member states could weigh in into that conversation. Now, we know that it hasn't always worked. For example, in the case of Costco's acquisition of part of a terminal in the Hamburg port, member states and the Commission weighed in, and Germany decided to go the other way anyways, right? So that is sort of how it works. You share information, you give opinion, but at the end of the day, the implementation power is with the member state. So the member state is still free to advance its national interest as it prefers to. That was objective number one. And this also introduces sort of obstacle number one, which is we are the European Union, but you have very strong national interest and you also have strong national specificities. So one sector that one country may want to protect may not be of interest for the other country. So what the review is trying to do is to create a minimum common denominator that all 27 have to abide to. The second obstacle the second obstacle has to do with capacity. You have member states that are able to have staff at disposal that can properly screen investments, and then, they have the right processes and they have the budget to do this. You have member states who don't, right? So that is sort of obstacle number two. Not everyone has the capacity to be able to screen inward investments. And then obstacle number three, I suppose, is also what do we mean by foreign direct investments? Some member states capture only merger and acquisitions, others capture greenfield investments as well. So there are a number of diversities between the member states that make it that to this day you don't have one single regulation for all 27. And to be totally honest, this is not necessarily uniquely the result of how they view the security threat, because, for example, Hungary has adopted an FDI screening mechanism based on what the European Union suggested. They don't share, large part of the assessment that, for example, Chinese investments pose a national security threat, but they adopted it. And then in terms of the implementation, they just green light large part of the investments. So there are big differences, and these differences are not always rooted in how the investments are viewed. They can be rooted in many different things. And now let's see if with the review, some of these differences can be mitigated. However, implementation is likely to keep being uneven throughout the 27.
Yeah, this is kind of like the forever issue. I I imagine we will never arrive to a point where everything will be perfectly, coordinated and implemented in a very cohesive way. So I guess that this will always be an important factor when looking at EU-China relations, right? This dual track component of member states, which we also know that China prefers as an avenue.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask because you also mentioned the case of Hungary, and so this made me think like of how prominent do you think the geopolitical component in the securitization process of Chinese FDI in Europe has been? You mentioned before that these securitization moves and these instruments are not specifically targeted, of course, toward China, but do you think that this growing security dimension is in the relationship is due to the fact that those FDIs are Chinese, or could it be more largely observed towards third parties and third countries FDIs in the EU?
It's a bit of half and half. I wouldn't say that geopolitics per se played a major role in the securitization of foreign direct investments, in the sense of China was the main issue, but not China as a growing geopolitical actor as much as China as a competitor for European companies, and China as a country that is not a security ally. So if you look at the two buckets, one is traditional security, the other one is competitiveness. In traditional security, the big issue was, okay, is this country that is not an ally getting any sensitive information or leverage towards us that can threaten our national security and stability? And so that the main issue is not an ally. And in the competitiveness bucket, the main issue was, okay, are we able to compete with this country, or is this country outcompeting us? And in that sense, it could have been China, but it could have been anyone else. And sort of the test for this, if you look at, now moving on from investments, if you look at the anti-coercion instrument that the EU developed, it was originally developed with the previous Trump administration, so the first Trump administration, when the tariffs against steel and aluminium were brought up. The EU realized that there was an external actor that could use economic levers against the European Union, and so they decided to start developing an anti-coercion instrument. Then, as the instrument developed, China also used economic coercion, and so they realized, okay, we can actually use eventually this instrument to respond to China as well. This is to say, it is true that for FDI, the trigger was China, and it is true that, for example, for anti-coercion, the trigger was the US. But if you look at the reports on FDI screening, you also notice that a large part of the investment screened are from the US. So even though China is and was the main trigger, it doesn't mean that it is, the only one concern that exists within the European Union. Now, obviously, once Russia's invasion of Ukraine happened, geopolitics starts to play a little bit more of a role in the conceptualization of the bilateral relationship. But it is, I want to clarify, there's actually a huge difference between how the US, for example, in the past as well, framed the risk related to China, where geopolitics did play a major role, and that how the EU framed the risk related to China. And that in part has to do with the bilateral relationship, the actual risk, but also the institutional culture of something like the European Commission, where you have very clear boxes that need to be checked in order to be able to act and do something.
Thank you very much. And I'm just following up on this with the last question before opening the floor to Q&A. So you mentioned the US, right? And I wanted to ask you, how do you think that the EU's partnership with the US has affected this securitization turn in EU-China relations? And also, I mean, considering the situation we are in now, and having seen how, in the past 2 months, we have witnessed a change in the reliability of the US as a partner to the EU. How do you think this change in the partnership with the US has affected or will affect the EU's posture toward China, if it will? I mean, if you think it will.
Thank you. I like this question because it gives me the opportunity to debunk one of the myths, that is that the EU adopted FDI screening because the US adopted CFIUS FIRMA, and so they told us, well, you also have to screen FDI. That wasn't the case, and it's one of the points that I try to test and research as much as possible within the book. It was a relatively EU-born type of process. And again, as I mentioned, it was the case of the trigger with KUKA and the two levels of member states and regional union aligning over one objective, which was, well, maybe we need to screen investments. And the fact that you already had relatively solid blueprints within the member states. So France had a system, Italy also had a system, by the way. So there were already things in place. So it could be done and it should have been done. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that once they decided that they wanted to adopt one, they didn't go to the US asking, okay, how do you do this? Is there something that we can learn from the way you do that? But that is a different thing than saying the US came and said, adopt an FDI screening. We decided as the European Union to adopt an FDI screening. And then we asked around, not just the US, by the way, how we could do FDI screening in the best way possible. So that is sort of point number one. It is, however, a bit of an exception in the economic security landscape because the economic security debate, especially in relation to China in Europe, has been highly influenced by what happened in the US, sometimes indirectly, as if the US was talking about, for example, decoupling, the EU thought, we don't like decoupling, so what defines our relationship? Right, de-risking. And then ultimately the US also adopted de-risking, right? So this is the kind of indirect influence. In other cases, the US adopted regulations such as the export controls of October 7, 2022, which had a direct impact on one member state, the Netherlands, having to update its own regulation for export controls. And in that case, you see a case of direct influence rather than, the more indirect type of things. And looking ahead, there's a lot of speculation around, well, if the relationship between the EU and the US worsens, then maybe that gives space for the relationship between China and the EU to improve. Point number one is the EU is actually quite open in general to improving the relationship with China. It's not, I know that sometimes we hear speeches and these sort of things and we think, okay, yeah, we went into that rabbit hole and there is no way of getting out of there. But there is space. The issue is, again, that unfair competition, that unlevel playing field that is present. And again, the sort of, as I mentioned before, the ever-present issue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's role in the invasion. I don't think that the bilateral relationship between the EU and China, from that perspective, from an economic security perspective, is ready to change dramatically, not even with the United States that are less friendly towards the European Union. And you see this through the fact that the EU keeps adopting trade defense instruments against the type of unfair trade that China is conducting. So that hasn't stopped since Trump became president of the United States. It hasn't stopped after the US announced tariffs against the European Union. So that sort of path doesn't seem to be ending just because our relationship with the EU relationship with the United States is less stable. This is what I would say, and then if we want to elaborate more or say more things about this, happy to.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I really very much agree with you on this point. But of course, I was curious to know your point of view, like especially because it seems like every week is more unpredictable than the week before. So it's hard also to understand where are we heading to, and like how how things will be balanced also, like vis-a-vis like what's
Yeah.
happening in the US, right? I'll just like take a couple of questions from the Q&A section. Um, so someone uh, Shahari Ali, like apologies for the pronunciation, asks how can the EU effectively balance its economic interdependence with China whilst also safeguarding its strategic industries and ensuring long-term economic security. And then they also ask what role should Europe play in shaping global economic governance to mitigate risks from economic coercion and strengthen resilience against external pressures from China. So we can start from this one.
Sure. Balancing, let's say, risks and opportunities in the bilateral relationship with China is the daily business of the European Union, which is why even when we were talking about de-risking, or when we were talking about assessing the over-dependencies from China, the whole debate was around managing risks rather than avoiding risks, right? So the EU never subscribed to decoupling. The whole idea was that, you know, the bilateral relationship brings risks with it. Is there a way we can still have the relationship and we still have, you know, an economic healthy exchange while we manage the risks? And the toolbox that you saw emerging from that debate tries to do that, right? So you're not going to block every single investment from China that comes into the European Union. You're going to eventually block these investments if they are in sectors that lead to risk to national security or public order, and if they are in critical national infrastructure, and, you know, after the evaluation. In most cases, by the way, investments are not blocked, but there are requirements that are attached to these investments. So rather than blocking the investment as a whole, you require, I don't know, that, for example, the board is composed in a certain way, or that, you know, you give guarantees that you're not just gonna acquire a company and leave after a year, right? These sort of things. And this is particularly evident around the debate for greenfield investments. So the bottom line is we do not produce large part of the green tech that we need. We import it from China. In terms of electric vehicles, the EU has imposed tariffs against the import of electric vehicles from China. Little comment. Those tariffs are not the 100% tariffs that the US adopted. Those tariffs are like balanced tariffs to make sure that you create a more fair competition. Now those tariffs won't stop imports of Chinese EVs into the European Union. But in any case, what they did was to trigger a flow of greenfield investments then from Chinese companies in Europe and in neighboring countries to build those things within the single market, or anyways outside of China. Okay, so the big question now is, we need those technologies. So what do we do? Do we accept these investments or do we reject them? So far, the answer is we accept them, right? So the answer hasn't been we actually reject them. The follow-up question is, okay, we accept them. Is there anything we can do to turn those investments into investments that bring a positive spillover to the European economy? And sorry, I know this seems like a very long story, but it's just to make you understand that it's not a yes and no type of debate, is not a black and white type of debate. Is often we want the economic relationship to exist, to resist, and to grow. We want to make sure, however, that we safeguard European interests first and foremost, and sometimes these require more complex answers than we block or we let go. It may be we let go with the following conditions, or yes, we block, but in a very moderate way. So this is sort of point number one. On the role of the EU in the global economic governance, so G7 was making interesting step forwards in terms of economic coercion. They agreed to share information around economic coercive behaviors. They were unable to agree to a mechanism where they would respond automatically to economic coercion if one of the G7 members was threatened, but at least some step forward were made in that regard. The EU adopted an anti-coercion instrument. Many other states did not. So that is also a good blueprint to start discussing a more collective action around economic cohesion. I want to make one point here. I talk about the G7 in the book. The book, I think I stopped writing the book February 2024. Yes. So it's been a year, and in the past 2 months, a lot of things have changed as well. So I think that now what becomes really important, not just for the EU, but even for the UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia, is that it will be up to them to drive the collective economic security agenda at global level. It's very difficult to see a scenario where the United States drives that in the future. So if this is something that countries care about, these countries to become the stakeholders, the main stakeholders and the main drivers of this type of policies.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm picking one other question. So Erdem Kaya asks, in your study, if you did, how did you measure dependency or over-dependency on China? So did you use certain measures like trade deficit between China and individual European economies? And at what scale, for example, de-risking was seen as a necessary step?
So no, I did not measure. This is not the scope of the book nor of the research. But if this is what you're interested in, the European Union has 3 reports on dependencies and over-dependencies. They have a very complicated econometric methodology, but they analyze dependencies and over-dependencies in general and then on China. Trade deficit is not necessarily the main concern. To begin with, trade deficit doesn't say much about dependencies. The quality of the trade deficit may be a little bit more of an indicator in terms of where you're importing, exactly what you're importing and what you're exporting. But the main concern usually is, do you have a single point of failure? So are you importing that one item that you need or that one component that you need from one place or one company, right? So that is the assessment that was going on when we were talking about dependencies and over dependencies. But this is not something that is covered in the book.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think other questions have been, there is a new one. Okay, so Marc Florent de Vera asks, how do we protect and safeguard European economic interests with the growing invading presence of AI? So I don't know if this falls within the remit of the book specifically, but I know you like sometimes you've touched upon that in the past. So do you think is it possible, first of all, do we have like I don't know share guidelines at the moment? Where do you see that going?
Okay, so this is a very complicated, it seems like every question is complicated, but this is particularly complicated because when we talk about AI, we could be talking about anything. Yeah. So in the case of the European Union, question number 1 is usually where are we in terms of development, AI, in terms of software? Like, are we even, doing this still? Or how difficult it is to buy into a sector where you already have US and Chinese giants? So that is sort of question number 1. Question number 2 is usually, do we have the suppliers that we need to be able to develop those things? And that is the debate around advanced chips, especially. One of the reasons why the Taiwanese TSMC invested in Dresden in Germany is actually to develop non-legacy, mostly legacy chips for the automotive and white goods sector. So we're still trying to answer that question of how do we take care of those advanced chips that are fundamental for AI, and the answer to the question so far is still imports, largely from TSMC. However, that is the case for basically everyone still at the moment. And then question number 3, which is I think is the one that the EU should be facing as soon as possible, is red tape. And this applies to a lot of different technologies and a lot of different softwares. Can we have one regulatory system for all the 27? If you want to attract investments in terms of venture capital in this new innovation sector, and if you want to be attractive, and if you want to have a business or a market that actually works around this type of emerging technologies, then it is fundamental that you have one regulation that regulates the whole sector throughout the 27. Now, I know step forward are being made in this regard, and some are also being made, for example, in connection to connected vehicles, trying to have one regulation for the whole of the 27. But these are the three buckets that the EU needs to think about when they think about AI. I'm not an AI expert, so I'm sure that an AI expert will be able to give you a much better answer. But at the moment, I know they're working to all three of them. The first two are particularly difficult to tackle at the moment.
Thank you very much. And just to conclude, I have one very final conclusive question, which is like in light of the discussion we had, in light of your findings and your book, which direction do you think EU-China relations are going towards? Also considering the current global unpredictability and instabilities.
It's a bit of a sad question, and it has to do with the fact that the EU is still important for China, and we shouldn't say that it isn't, but it's definitely not among China's priorities when it comes to foreign policy. And the reason for that are multiple. In terms of countries that are concerned about, the US occupies a large part of their attention. And in terms of countries where they see opportunities, developing economies are much more important to them than the European Union. So much so that while it remains true that the EU is an important market for China, especially for the export-driven type of economy that China has, what we saw in the past few years is that China itself is de-risking from the EU market, right? So trying to diversify the market destination for its products and trying to open and enlarge markets, especially in developing economies. So I would say we are in a bit of a pickle because the EU is now doing everything that it should do to level the playing field with China. But in the meantime, it has lost some of its leverage. And so it will have to be extremely strategic about how that balance that we talked about before, right? Making sure that the market remains relevant with China while avoiding to create national security risks.
Thank you very much. If you can take like one last question that came in now, like I mean, very briefly. I know you're probably very tired after this
No,
1 hour.
that's all right.
But so Valerio Neyumi asks whether the EU is also concerned about outward FDI to China from European stakeholders. So if that is a concern at the European level.
So it's a debate, and it has been a debate for a while. It must be said that often for the EU is less of a concern. The analysis that we have in terms of outbound investments into China from the European Union are not necessarily sectors of national security concern. Slightly different, for example, the debate is for the United Kingdom, especially because they have the city and all of that. Is an ongoing debate, is trying to understand whether we need to screen them to begin with. And again, it needs to be put against what I said before about capacity. There's already a lot of struggle around being able to capture all the investment that come into the EU and trying to understand the national security risk. When it comes to those that go outside from the EU, it becomes even more complicated. One debate that perhaps is slightly more important in my opinion, although this is important, is the one about research security and research collaboration in innovation and development in terms of trying to understand exactly the risks that come to this and the opportunities and what type of policies or behavior should be adopted.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Francesca, for being with us and for the discussion. It was really interesting. Thank you everyone for attending. And thanks to the Center for Geopolitics for hosting. Of course, like this conversation was again incredibly timely. And if you can go to purchase Francesca's book because is great. I think it will probably be in the I don't know, in all the syllabus that look at EU-China
I hope
relations.
so.
Yeah. So it's really like you have to read it if you're looking at these issues and at the evolution of EU-China relations in the future. So I think you can purchase it via Bristol University Press. So yeah, I hope you do. And thank you so much, Francesca, again, and everyone for attending.